I'm Caroline Barry, Program Manager of the Composting Consortium. The Composting Consortium is an initiative of closed-loop partners Center for the Circular Economy. And what we do at the center is we unite stakeholders across the value chain to come together under a pre-competitive collaboration model to solve for really complex material challenges. And in the case of the Composting Consortium, we're hyper-focused on scaling food waste composting infrastructure in the United States and ensuring a circular economy, really, and responsible end-of-life outcomes of certified compostable packaging. There are many different ways to conduct a field test at a composting facility, at a commercial composting facility. The way that the Composting Consortium approached field testing for our disintegration study was we modeled our methodology after several existing standards that already existed in the field. So looking to different aspects of methodologies that were already being utilized and trialed. For example, we deployed a very common field testing technique known as the mesh bag method that kind of literally holds and contains different materials. You put that into a pile and then commence the field test. We also trialed a new and distinct sort of emerging method of field testing known as the dose method, where you load materials directly into a pile. What was distinct about the Composting Consortium's disintegration study is that we measured the disintegration of compostable packaging, and alongside of that, we measured operating parameters. So we have an understanding of what was happening in the compost piles that support the disintegration of compostable packaging. So we were looking at metrics like moisture, temperature, oxygen, carbon and nitrogen ratio, pH balance, just to name a few, to see how are these variables potentially impacting a compostable product's ability to disintegrate. And what should a compost operator know if they're willingly accepting these materials? How can they ensure that the products are going to break down in reasonable timeframes based on how they're operating their facilities? So that was really a key element of how we approached this study and what informed our methodology. It was more than just looking at how the products themselves performed in the piles, but also how was the composter operating, what were the operating parameters they were meeting consistently over time, and then we could sort of overlay the two factors, leading us to this very comprehensive data set and story really around what was happening in the piles. And I think moving forward, that's certainly being looked at in many different ways, but I think moving forward we'll see a lot more of that with field testing. It's more than just the disintegration of the materials, because the lab testing often proves that ability. Now it's about, okay, what's happening in the piles to support the breakdown of these materials as well. I think both lab certification and in-field testing are complementary, right? We can't have one without the other. I think it's really important for brands and manufacturers to pursue both paths, if they're going to market with compostable products and packaging, for many reasons. Because upstream, you want faith and credibility that you have the information around the R&D and it performs well in a laboratory setting. But downstream, it's just as important. You want to know that these materials actually operate in the real world, in a compost facility as designed and intended to do. So yeah, my answer would be that both serve a role, and I think, you really can't have one without the other, and I think moving forward, you'll see a lot more of perhaps an amalgamation between the two. So the Composting Consortium's contamination pilot, really the impetus for that study and that work was to attempt to address the contamination challenge head on. There was a lot of, I want to say, a combination of misinformation and also critical data gaps that existed in the market around what was really happening in regards to contamination. What materials are showing up in the feedstock that are causing the greatest challenges for composters? What's remaining during the composting process? And perhaps most importantly, what's ending up in the finished product, in the finished compost? So really, I think the consortium's contamination pilot, our sole focus was to get to the root of that, to understand, to quantify, to characterize the materials coming into the site, making their way through the composting process, and ultimately potentially determining whether or not they're ending up in the finished product and what the impacts are from that. I think what we gained so much from those studies and so many key insights and learnings around what the material makeup was of these contaminants and what that looked like in the field, around drawing correlations between whether or not, for example, a composter takes compostable packaging, right? We learned that that's not necessarily going to increase contamination. There's a lot more happening upstream. There are several underlying factors at play that are oftentimes outside of the control of the composter that we as an industry need to be thinking about to solve for upstream before it reaches the composter. We were also able to place a monetary value on contamination, right? So assigning a financial number to what exactly does it cost a composter to deal with contamination. I think that is such an important and critical question to be thinking about for the industry, because in order to solve the contamination challenge, it requires innovation, it also requires funding, and it requires collaboration from really all stakeholders throughout the value chain to understand their part in creating cleaner streams. So that's my hope for kind of how the industry will use the information from the contamination pilot we ran, but also what was our thought process going into it. What keeps me optimistic about the Composting Consortium's goals, but also what the industry wants to achieve, is events like this, right? The BPI Summit, seeing how many stakeholders across the value chain show up with the same intentions and the same goals. It's because we all care. We're just coming at it with different viewpoints because we all work in different spaces across this entire ecosystem. And that gives me a lot of optimism for the challenges that we're trying to solve, because when it comes to a circular economy, when it comes to solving for food waste and ensuring responsible outcomes for compostable packaging, we can't do it in vacuums. It requires collaboration. And I think as well, when we look at the Composting Consortium's model, that's something that we lean into very heavily, is this pre-competitive, collaborative model in spirit. And BPI is one of the industry partners on the Composting Consortium. And it's a perfect example of how collaborations between innovation centers like the Center for the Circular Economy and industry groups like BPI, amongst many other stakeholders, including brands, composters, NGOs, academic institutions, you name it, can come together to drive change collectively. I think we're already starting to see a changing of the tides, and it's events like this that kind of re-spark that optimism for me in attaining that circular economy that we're all driving for.